Hello, welcome to my recap of the game between Fabiano Caruana and Sergey Karjakin from round 1 of Tata Steel. We had a very interesting game here. First, the opening was the Queen's Gambit exchange variation, and it began something like this, with knight f6, c4, e6, and we got this move order, after which Karjakin played d5 and Fabiano took on d5, e takes d5 and knight c3. And we have this very famous Carlsbad structure in which white usually goes for either minority attack with b5, b2, b4, trying to undermine those pawns on the queen side, or he goes for some central activities like pushing f4, maybe preparing e4 with f3 before that, and Fabiano here plays bishop f4. Karjakin answers with bishop d6, trying to develop at once and also to offer a trade of this very strong bishop on f4. Fabiano takes on d6, queen takes d6 and e3, after which black castle, and queen c2 now by Fabiano, trying to stop bishop f5 and also trying to get away from the pin on g4, which makes bishop g4 now less appealing to black. If bishop g4 happens, there is always knight e5, hitting the bishop, and bishop has to be now passive with bishop h5, and it allows white a very pleasant game with bishop d3 and maybe even going for h3, g4 and castling on the long side. That's why black decides to deploy his bishop differently. He wants to get bishop a6 on the next move by playing b6. Now Fabiano plays rook c1, preparing some pressure on the c6 pawn. He tries with g6 first, trying to force white to play bishop d3 to lose one tempo, and then to offer a trade. So Fabiano plays bishop d3, and now bishop a6. So basically white spent a tempo and black got g6 for free, but it's questionable if g6 is really a useful move to black. White took on a6, and finally he castled. The c6 pawn is a weakness in black's position, and he needs to be very careful now. Still, the position is quite dry, and black has good chances to hold this position. He goes rook fc8, trying to support this pawn on c6, rook fd1, anticipating some c5 break, which would make d5 a good target for white. Now knight c7, trying to hold on to this d5 pawn in case some c5 push happens in the future, and also trying to meet potential b4 with a5, trying to break the structure on the queen side. Now Fabiano plays a3, preparing potentially b4 at some point, but it's not so easy to push b4 because there's always some jump, potential jump on c4 with the black knight, and the b4 might backfire in that case. Karjakin plays knight e6, puts the knight to a better square, and now h3, simply putting giving some space to the king. And now queen e7. Karjakin is heading towards b7, trying to maybe support the d5 pawn from the distance, not from the d file because it might come under pin. So he wants to get to b7 and somehow prepare c5. I guess that was his intention. Now knight e5 by Fabiano, and queen b7, like I said, trying to defend the pawn at the same time and also to cover this d5 square. And here Fabiano chose to play queen e2, trying to get his queen to the other side. What was interesting here was some plan with f4. trying to break the king side with f5 next. This would make black to go to g7 to cover f5 square, but now after e4 the position becomes really interesting, somewhat dangerous to black, since it's not really good to capture on e4 because of this and having some jumps to d6, and if black captures on e4 there is always queen e4 and c6 pawn is now quite weak. So this could be a good option for white, but instead he chose to play queen e2 here, going for different plans. Knight e8 now by Karjakin, trying to get the knight to d6 and somehow to oppose potential b4 with knight c4. Maybe not when the knight is on e5, but if he kicks it away with f6, then maybe to go to c4. Fabiano plays b4 here, and now a6, stopping the b5 break, which would make this pawn chain unstable, and in the end it could harm this d5 pawn, which would become protectionless. So we have this position, and it's a question how to continue as white. You might argue you can play e4 in this position, which I think is also very good. But first, Fabiano plays h4, trying to induce some weaknesses in the position. And by weaknesses, I mean to force black to play h5 and to weaken the king side, especially the g5 square. And also with h5, you discourage f6 because the g6 is becoming quite vulnerable. But anyways, Karjakin plays h5, and now it's time for e4, the break in the center. And again, if you take on e4, the c6 is more exposed, so it doesn't seem like a good option for black. And in this position, Karjakin makes a huge mistake, not so obvious why, let me tell you, and he plays king g7. Here it was best to go knight to g7 from e6, because after a potential exchange of these pawns, the knight can jump to f5 and create some counterplay against d4 or h4. And after the king goes to g7, there's no knight g7 in the near future, because the king has to step away from g7 to h7, let's say, and he's losing some precious time. And Fabiano had a chance to take over the game, but he played knight f3. He went back, he went a bit passive, I would say. The knight on e5 was really good, but probably he didn't see any other option for himself. But you can pause the video here and try to find the best move in this position for white. I'll give you a couple of seconds. If you have found the move f4, congratulations, because this is a really superb move. White is heading towards playing f5 next, trying to break the black's position on the king side, trying to open up the king. If black takes on f4, there is queen f3, and after knight e6, rook f1 goes, and black's position looks really dangerous. Now f7 is under pressure, d5 is also under pressure, and if black goes with f6 here, there's knight g6, sacrifice, and after this, to give a check, now the knight on e6 is attacked, so king f7 seems like the only reasonable choice here, but after this check and the knight g7, white has e5, crushing move, continuing this attack. Black is not able to keep the position closed as he would like, and if he wants to do it in some way, he can do it with e5. At least not opening both E and F files. White takes on F5, and after King E7, just White can double rooks, after which Black's position becomes really unpleasant. The attack is just too powerful. White can choose between Rook F8 or Rook F7 next, and it's just way too much pressure. And Black's extra piece doesn't really feel like extra piece, because if you see those pieces, you cannot say that they're any useful to Black. So Caruana missed a big chance in this position. After King G7, he played Knight F3 back, and now Karjakin manages somehow to consolidate his position with Knight F6, E5 and Knight G4. Now the knight is stationed well on G4. If needed, he can go back to H6 and F5 to put some pressure on D4 and H4. And now Queen D2 by Fabiano, trying to go for Knight G5 next, to exchange this very nicely placed knight on E6. But now Karjakin plays on the other side. He wants to break the queen side by A5, and White goes with Knight G5. Anyways, we have some exchanges, AB, AB. I think that now the exchange on E6 is not so good because of strengthening the center by capturing by the pawn, and that now C5 is really useful for Black. In the previous lines, C5 would weaken D5, but with addition of this pawn on E6, now C5 is much more realistic, although it allows some Knight B5, Knight D6 ideas. But let's go back to the game. White captured on B4, and now Queen D7 by Karjakin. Maybe Queen E7 was slightly better because it actually hits on B4. But okay, Queen D7 is also not so bad. Knight goes back to E2, and now Rook A3. Rook C2 by Caruana, trying to double on the C file. That was the whole point of Knight going back to E2. Queen E7, and now Rook DC1. Hitting on C6, and now Karjakin plays C5, which is a huge mistake, I would say. The best way to go here was to go Rook B3, hitting the B4 pawn, and after Knight E6 to capture with the pawn. But still, this position feels a bit uncomfortable because G6 and E6 might get under some attack by the knight on F4. It still feels a bit suspicious, but objectively speaking, it should be okay for Black. Practically speaking, not so much. So Karjakin makes a huge mistake here and goes for C5. And now again, Caruana has a chance to take the game over, and now he took on C5, which is a bad move because E5 becomes very soft, so weak now, and the best move here was to capture with the B pawn, keeping the structure very solid, and after BC to capture on E6 first, and after this to first go with E3 with F3, because if White captures immediately on C5, there is Queen H4 with some threats like Queen H2 or Queen F2. So first kick this knight away and then take on C5. And after capturing, to have a C passed pawn. And in case of Queen H4, to just go C6, and the C pawn becomes quite a factor in this position. But in the game, what happened was that Caruana took with the D pawn, making E5 weak. Karjakin took on C5, and he took back by the pawn. Also, Knight E6 included doesn't change much, because after F6, F3, let's say, again, because of the same queen h4 idea. Now black takes on e5, that's the problem, that's the difference between two lines. Knight can actually capture on e5, and after rook c5, taking bc5, knight d3. Now the only move that saves the game for white is knight f4, because otherwise black just captures on c5 and he is a pawn up in that case. So knight f4 would be played, and after some exchanges this would be quite okay for black. This following endgame would be okay for black because he also has a passed pawn and he can deflect the queen, and also the queen endgames have a quite drawish tendency because of a potential perpetual check. So Fabi chose to capture back with the pawn. Now some exchanges occur, hg, queen e5, and now because of queen h2 ideas, Fabi chose to play queen d4, king f8, and now g3. Stopping this queen h2, Karjakin takes anyways and goes knight e5. With knight e5 he wants to get to c4, trying to make a bridge on the c file, trying to disconnect rooks and the pawn on c5. And now king g2 by Caruana. If by any chance he played c6, there's rook a4, and after knight b5, let's say, to go knight d3 first, and maybe even just going to b4 next, but maybe if he goes rook d1 to go rook c4, and if he captures dc, c7, and king goes closer, and the knight will eventually get to d5 somehow and capture on c7. So this also looks like a draw for black. Fabiano plays in the game king g2, but this allows knight c4, after which the c pawn is pretty much doomed. Knight b5, rook a6, and after this some exchanges occur. Knight captures on d5, and after rook d5, black is even a pawn up after this whole adventure. Rook g5, but this is still a drawish position because now black is forced to accept the trade after rook c5, since rook g4 would just lead to rook c4, and how to avoid this. So he took on c5, and after a couple of more moves, because we have already a drawn position, they played for a bit longer, but black couldn't do much. Black couldn't make any progress in this position, so they played for a few moves more, but after rook b2 he went to h3, and this position is a draw. They agreed to a draw because there's no way that black can somehow exploit his extra pawn. Because if the king is the real problem, how to activate the king? If the king gets any more active, let's say goes to d5, then white even has an option to cut off the king and go to h4, g5, and attack the g6 pawn. Actually, the biggest problem is the g6 pawn, which always needs some babysitting to keep alive. So it was reasonable that they agreed for a draw. Black simply didn't have any good chances in this endgame, and this was it. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section. I will answer to you, and that's it. I'm going to be posting more videos on this tournament, and yeah, that's it. See you soon, and bye bye.